In the spring of 2014, a team of structural engineers working under the authority of the Soprintendenza Speciale di Roma lowered a drill into the ground beneath the Colosseum's northern corridor. It was a routine inspection, the kind of quiet, unglamorous work that holds ancient monuments together. They were checking the integrity of the foundations, nothing more. The drill went down through compacted soil, through centuries of buried sediment, through layers of Roman concrete that had been undisturbed for nearly 2,000 years, and then it stopped. Not because it hit solid ground, because it hit nothing. A cavity, a hollow space, sitting in the darkness beneath one of the most studied buildings on Earth, a space that appeared on no blueprint, matched no known record, and had apparently been lying there in silence, since before the medieval world had even begun to forget that Rome once ruled everything. That moment, a drill pausing in the dark, is a small thing, but it points towards something much larger. Because the Colosseum has always presented itself as an open book. 50,000 seats, 80 archways, one arena floor. Historians have written about it for centuries. Tourists have walked its corridors for generations. And yet beneath the stone and the sand and the faded memory of everything that once happened there, questions remain, quietly, patiently, the way old things tend to wait. What was the full extent of the machinery buried beneath the arena floor? Machinery so precisely engineered that modern architects still cannot fully explain how it was calculated. Why did the original floor vanish completely? And what does its disappearance tell us about what was truly happening inside those walls? And what lies in the deepest, unexcavated layers beneath the structure itself? Layers that a georadar survey in 2015 identified, but that have never been opened. Those are the questions this documentary was built around, and we are going to follow them all the way down. Before we go any further, if you are new here, welcome. My name is Mr. H, and this is the Mr. H Chronicles, a place where we take the ancient, the forgotten, and the buried, and we bring them slowly back into the light. If that sounds like something worth staying for, consider subscribing and turning on the bell notification. It is a small gesture that means a great deal to a channel like this one. Now, back beneath the stone. Because the story of what lies beneath the Colosseum does not begin with the building itself. It begins with the man who was erased to make room for it, and the lake he left behind. It begins with a question that no one thought to ask for nearly 2,000 years. Stand at the center of the Colosseum today, and you are standing in a wound. The wooden floor is gone, the sand is gone. What remains is a vast open cavity, a labyrinth of brick corridors, crumbling arches, and dark passageways stretching 70 meters beneath the arena in every direction. Tourists lean over the railing and take photographs. Guides describe gladiators and emperors, but almost no one asks the most obvious question of all. How did any of it actually work? Because here is something the textbooks tend to gloss over. The Colosseum was not simply a stadium. It was a machine, one of the most complex mechanical systems ever built in the ancient world, and for over 1,000 years after its abandonment, the full scale of that system remained hidden, buried, and largely misunderstood. What archaeologists and engineers have uncovered in the centuries since is not just impressive. In several cases, it is genuinely difficult to explain. The subterranean network beneath the Colosseum is called the hypogeum from the Greek, meaning simply underground. It consists of 2 full levels of corridors, chambers, ramps, and shafts cut into the earth beneath the arena floor, covering an area roughly equivalent to a modern city block. And yet, for the better part of 16 centuries after the Colosseum's abandonment, nobody fully mapped it. Nobody excavated it systematically. The Renaissance architect Domenico Fontana documented portions of the structure in 1590, but his notes describe mostly rubble, flooded passages, and structural confusion. He could not determine what the chambers were for. He moved on. It was not until 1874 that the Italian archaeologist Pietro Rosa, working under the direction of the newly unified Italian government, began the first serious excavation of the hypogeum. What Rosa found over the following years fundamentally changed the understanding of how Roman spectacle actually functioned. The underground network was not storage. It was not a dungeon. It was the engine room of the most sophisticated entertainment system the ancient world had ever produced. At the heart of the hypogeum's design were the pegmata, a series of vertical shafts, each fitted with a wooden cage platform, operated by a system of ropes, pulleys, and counterweights. When researchers from the Soprintendenza Speciale di Roma conducted a detailed structural survey of the hypogeum in the early 2000s, they confirmed what Rosa had first suspected. The Colosseum contained not one or two of these elevator mechanisms, but approximately 80 individual lifting shafts distributed across the arena floor. 80. Each shaft was capable of raising a loaded platform, carrying a wild animal, a piece of stage scenery, or in some cases a human being from the depths of the hypogeum to the surface of the arena floor. Engineering reconstructions, including work carried out by the Rome-based firm Scarlata and Associates in consultation with the Colosseum Archaeological Park, suggest that with a full crew operating the counterweight system, all 80 platforms could be raised simultaneously in under 30 seconds. What remains unexplained is precisely how the Roman engineers of the 1st century AD calculated the counterweight ratios necessary to achieve this level of mechanical coordination. No technical manuals, design documents, or engineering specifications from the construction of the hypogeum have ever been found. The original blueprints, if such documents existed in a form we would recognize, have never surfaced in any archive, private collection, or archaeological site. What we have instead are the structures themselves, and when engineers study them today, the precision is difficult to account for. Consider the practical challenge. A lion or a tiger could weigh 200 kilograms or more. A bear, considerably heavier. These animals were held in wooden cages in the lower corridors of the hypogeum, often for days before they were needed for a spectacle. They were stressed, unpredictable, and extremely dangerous. Moving them into position beneath the arena shafts, loading them onto the elevator platforms, and then raising them to the surface, all of this had to happen in near darkness, in confined passageways, and with enough speed and coordination to maintain the theatrical momentum of the show above. Kathleen Coleman, professor of Latin at Harvard University and one of the leading scholars of Roman spectacle, has written extensively about the logistics of arena performance. In her research, Coleman notes that the Roman spectacles described in ancient sources, including the 100 Days of Games held by Emperor Titus at the Colosseum's inauguration in 80 AD, during which an estimated 9,000 animals were killed, would have required an organizational infrastructure of extraordinary complexity. The hypogeum, she argues, was not incidental to those spectacles, it was their foundation. The corridors of the hypogeum were arranged in a radial pattern extending outward from the central spine beneath the arena. Each corridor connected to the next via perpendicular passageways, creating a grid that allowed animals and personnel to be moved horizontally through the underground network before being directed to their assigned shaft. The walls of these corridors still bear the iron rings used to secure animal cages. The stone floors still show the wear patterns of heavy loads being dragged into position. Archaeologists have noted that the placement of the shaft openings in the arena floor above was not random. The 80 openings were distributed in a pattern that ensured no single section of the audience was ever more than a few meters from an emergence point, meaning that when animals appeared, they appeared everywhere at once, from multiple directions simultaneously, with no warning. The effect on a crowd of 50,000 people would have been, in the truest sense of the word, spectacular. In the surviving stonework of the hypogeum, researchers have identified several features that still resist complete explanation. Valerie Higgins of the British School at Rome, who has spent years investigating the structures beneath the arena, has documented a series of precisely cut grooves in the stone walls at regular intervals throughout the hypogeum. These grooves are clean, consistent, and clearly intentional. Higgins describes them as evidence of guide channels, tracks along which some form of vertical mechanism moved repeatedly over many years, wearing smooth paths into the stone. The grooves are present at every shaft location, they are present in the interconnecting corridors, and they are present in several locations where no shaft opening has been identified in the arena floor above. What was moving through those channels? One theory suggests that portions of the arena floor itself were designed to be mechanically repositioned during a performance not merely open to release animals, but shifted laterally, creating new configurations of the fighting surface in real time, while the audience watched. This would align with ancient accounts, including descriptions in the writings of the poet Martial, of the arena floor appearing to transform between one act and the next, as though by supernatural means. Martial, who attended the inaugural games in 80 AD, wrote that the arena seemed to change its face entirely between spectacles. His language is poetic, but the archaeology suggests he may have been describing something literal, operating a system of 80 counterweight elevators, managing the movement of hundreds of animals, coordinating the timing of multiple simultaneous releases. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened with a small crew. Estimates based on the physical dimensions of the hypogeum suggest that a full capacity performance at the Colosseum may have required between 200 and 400 workers operating in the underground network simultaneously. These were specialized workers, not the slaves who cleaned the corridors or the guards who watched the animal cages, but trained mechanical operators who understood the counterweight systems, who knew the layout of the underground grid, and who could execute a coordinated release sequence on command from a supervisor they could not see. How were instructions passed from the arena surface to the operators below? The hypogeum has no windows. Sound would have been almost entirely absorbed by the noise of 50,000 people above. Researchers from the Colosseum Archaeological Park have proposed that a system of visual signals, torches, flags, or mechanical indicators may have been used to relay timing information from a coordinator stationed near the arena edge down through small apertures in the vaulted ceiling of the upper hypogeum level. No physical evidence of such a signaling system has been definitively identified, but the apertures exist, and they open directly above the primary shaft locations. Here is what makes the hypogeum genuinely difficult to place in its historical context. Nothing like it had existed before. The Greeks built theatres of extraordinary elegance and acoustic precision. The Egyptians built structures of almost incomprehensible scale, but the hypogeum of the Colosseum, a fully mechanized, multi-level underground operations center, designed to produce theatrical effects in real time, before a live audience, has no known precursor in the ancient world. Lynn Lancaster, whose landmark 2005 study, Concrete Vaulted Construction, in Imperial Rome remains a foundational text in Roman engineering scholarship, has argued that the hypogeum represents a convergence of multiple independent engineering traditions: military tunnel construction, theatrical stage machinery, hydraulic engineering, and counterweight mechanics being applied simultaneously to a single purpose for what appears to be the first time in recorded history. Where the knowledge came from, who designed the system in its final integrated form, whether that designer left any record of their methods, these questions remain open. What remains unexplained is not the existence of the hypogeum, that at least we have found. What remains unexplained is the mind that imagined it, the engineer, or engineers who looked at an empty valley on the edge of Rome's most prestigious district in the final years of the 1st century AD, and conceived of building not just an arena, but a machine that could make the impossible appear inevitable, 50,000 times over. The wooden floor above them is long gone, the sand is gone, the animals are gone, but the machine is still there. 2,000 years later, in the dark beneath the city, it is still there. Imagine you are sitting in the upper tiers of the Colosseum, on the morning of its inaugural games in 80 AD. The arena floor below you is solid wood, a continuous surface of thick planks fitted together across the full width of the ellipse, covering an area roughly equivalent to half a modern football field. It is covered in pale sand. The sand is raked flat. Attendants in tunics move across it in the early light, making final preparations. The whole surface looks permanent, immovable, as fixed to the ground beneath it as the stone walls rising around you on every side. By afternoon, that floor has disappeared, not damaged, not destroyed, not gradually dismantled over a period of days, simply gone, replaced, according to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, by something that should not have been possible inside a landlocked stone building in the center of a city. What Dio describes, and what archaeologists and engineers have spent the better part of 2 centuries attempting to reconstruct, is one of the most audacious engineering feats in the history of human performance. The floor of the Colosseum could vanish, and when it did, the arena filled with water. Cassius Dio wrote his history of Rome in the early 3rd century AD, drawing on sources that included eyewitness accounts of the Colosseum's inaugural games more than a century earlier. His description of those games is detailed, enthusiastic, and at several points almost impossible to credit. Among the events he records is a naval battle, anomalies staged inside the Colosseum itself, on its very first day of public operation. Dio describes warships maneuvering in the flooded arena, soldiers fighting from the decks, and thousands of spectators watching from the tiered seating above. He mentions sea creatures, fish, he says, though he does not specify the species visible in the water below the ships. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, historians treated this account with considerable skepticism. The Colosseum, by any reasonable assessment, was not designed as a water basin. Its floor was wooden. Its substructure, the hypogeum, was an elaborate mechanical system of corridors and shafts that would have been entirely destroyed by flooding. The logistics of filling an elliptical arena measuring 83 meters by 48 meters with enough water to float warships, in the middle of Rome using first-century technology, seemed to strain credibility past its breaking point. Then the engineers started looking at the drains. In 2021, a research team from the Politecnico di Milano, working in collaboration with the Colosseum Archaeological Park, completed a systematic survey of the drainage infrastructure beneath and around the Colosseum's foundation. Their findings, while not yet fully published in peer-reviewed form as of this writing, were reported in preliminary form at the 2022 conference of the International Association for Classical Archaeology, held in Athens. What the Milan team found was not a simple drainage system. What they found was a dual-function hydraulic network, a system capable of both draining water away from the structure and, critically, of directing water into the arena basin from an external source. The key infrastructure was a series of large-diameter conduit channels running beneath the hypogeum level, connecting to what the team identified as a branch of the Aqua Claudia, one of the 9 major aqueducts that supplied Rome with water during the Imperial period. The Aqua Claudia, completed under Emperor Claudius in 52 AD, was among the highest pressure aqueducts in the Roman system, capable of delivering water at significant volume and velocity from its source in the Anio Valley, approximately 69 kilometers east of the city. One theory suggests that when the arena was prepared for a naumachia, the wooden floor was removed in sections using the same system of mechanical hoisting points identified in the hypogeum, and the drainage channels were reversed, directing water from the aqueduct branch upward into the sealed arena basin. The hypogeum itself would have been sealed off from the flooding by a system of waterproof barriers, protecting the mechanical infrastructure below, while the arena above filled to the depth required for navigation. The conduit channels exist. The connection to the Aqua Claudia is architecturally consistent. What remains unexplained is the precise sequence of operations that would have allowed the transition from dry arena to navigable water basin and back again within the timeframe that ancient accounts suggest. This is where the physical evidence becomes particularly interesting. In the year 2000, Kathleen Coleman of Harvard University published a detailed analysis of the Roman naumachia tradition, examining both the literary sources and the structural evidence from the Colosseum and from earlier purpose-built water arenas in Rome. Coleman's work drew attention to a feature of the Colosseum's wooden floor that had received relatively little scholarly attention up to that point. The floor was not built to be permanent. Forensic examination of the surviving stone supports and anchor points around the perimeter of the arena revealed a pattern of fittings, iron brackets, slotted stone channels, and removable wooden crossbeams that were specifically designed to allow the floor planks to be detached, lifted in sections, and reassembled. The fittings showed evidence of repeated use. The wood grain impressions preserved in some of the stone anchor points showed wear patterns consistent with multiple cycles of installation and removal over an extended period. Coleman concluded that the arena floor of the Colosseum was designed from the beginning as a demountable system, not a fixed structure, but a modular surface that could be reconfigured or entirely removed depending on the requirements of a given spectacle. Archaeologists have noted that this finding reframes the entire engineering philosophy of the Colosseum in a significant way. The building was not designed around a fixed floor with an optional drainage system added as an afterthought. The building was designed around the absence of a floor, around the assumption that the floor would sometimes be there and sometimes not, and that the transition between those two states needed to be achievable quickly, reliably, and repeatedly. This was not a stadium with a removable floor. It was a transformation machine, and the floor was simply one of its interchangeable components. Here is a detail that tends to get lost in the broader narrative of the Colosseum's history. The naumachia staged at the inaugural games in 80 AD was not the last water spectacle held in the arena. Ancient sources, including Suetonius and the elder Pliny, describe additional water events at the Colosseum during the reigns of later emperors. The exact number is uncertain. The records are fragmentary, and the terminology used by Roman historians for different types of water spectacle is not always consistent. What is clear is that at some point in the late 1st or early 2nd century AD, the water spectacles stopped. The hypogeum was expanded and deepened, new mechanical infrastructure was added, and the arena floor, from that point forward, appears to have remained in place as a permanent installation rather than a removable one. One theory suggests this transition reflects a deliberate policy change under one of the Flavian successors, possibly Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD, and who is known from other sources to have had a complicated relationship with the spectacle traditions established by his father Vespasian and brother Titus. The expansion of the hypogeum under Domitian's reign effectively made large-scale flooding impossible. The mechanical infrastructure below the arena could not be sealed against water at the new depth. Whether this was an engineering decision, a political decision, or simply a reflection of changing audience tastes, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that the capacity for water transformation, one of the most astonishing technical achievements built into the original structure, was permanently disabled within approximately 20 years of its first use. The machine was changed, and the change was never reversed. Which brings us to a different kind of vanishing, not the temporary, intentional removal of the floor for a performance, but its permanent disappearance from history. The wooden arena floor of the Colosseum was gone by the late 6th century AD. We know this because descriptions of the building from that period make no reference to it, and structural evidence from early medieval modifications to the arena interior assumes the absence of the floor as a baseline condition. But no ancient or early medieval source records the removal of the floor, explains the reason for its removal, or describes what happened to the timber, roughly 100,000 square meters of heavy load-bearing wooden planking, a volume of timber representing an enormous material resource in any period, simply ceased to be documented. One theory suggests the floor was dismantled for its timber during one of the several periods of severe resource scarcity that affected Rome between the 5th and 7th centuries, when the collapse of the Western Imperial administration disrupted the supply chains that had kept the city fed, heated, and built. In that context, the floor of an abandoned arena would have represented a valuable and accessible source of construction material. What remains unexplained is why no record of this dismantling was kept, given that the Colosseum remained a recognized landmark throughout the period, and was explicitly protected by several papal edicts from the 8th century onward. Either the floor was removed before those protections were in place, or its removal was considered unremarkable enough not to warrant documentation. In either case, the record goes silent. The floor that once carried the weight of 9,000 animals, of gladiators and emperors, of warships and water, and 50,000 watching eyes, vanished without a written trace. In 2023, the Italian Ministry of Culture announced the approval of an €18 million project to restore the Colosseum's arena floor, installing a new retractable wooden surface above the exposed hypogeum, making the interior usable for cultural events, and giving visitors a renewed sense of the original spatial experience. The project has received widespread public support. The visual argument for it is compelling. A covered floor transforms the visitor experience in ways that an open pit of exposed archaeology cannot. But several members of the archaeological community have raised a concern that has not received sufficient attention in the broader press coverage of the project. The installation of the new floor requires the placement of structural supports directly into the upper level of the hypogeum. Before those supports can be set, the ground surface of the upper hypogeum needs to be prepared, leveled, cleared, and in some areas reinforced. This preparation work will, inevitably, disturb soil layers that have not been systematically excavated or analyzed. What remains unexplained and what may remain unexplained permanently, once the new floor is in place, is what those undisturbed soil layers contain. The preliminary surveys conducted before the project's approval identified organic material, metal fragments, and structural anomalies in the upper hypogeum floor that were flagged for further investigation. That further investigation has not, as of this writing, been completed. The new floor is being installed regardless. The arena that once transformed itself from dry land to open water and back again, in the space of a single afternoon, is about to undergo one final transformation. and this time what lies beneath it may not be recoverable. There is a building in Cologne, Germany, that took 632 years to complete. Construction on the Cologne Cathedral began in 1248. It was not finished until 1880. For much of that 6th-century span, the building sat unfinished, a permanent construction site in the center of a medieval city, its incomplete spires wrapped in wooden scaffolding, so iconic that the scaffolding itself became a landmark. The cathedral is a masterpiece of Gothic engineering. Its builders were among the most skilled craftsmen of their era, and it took them more than 6 centuries. The Colosseum took 10 years, not 10 years for the foundation. 10 years for the entire structure, all 4 stories, all 80 arched facades, all the vaulted corridors, all the seating for 50,000 people, all the subterranean hypogeum beneath, all the mechanical infrastructure within it. Construction began under Emperor Vespasian around 70 AD and was completed under his son Titus in 80 AD. In time for the inaugural games, the Colosseum is larger than the Cologne Cathedral by almost any measurement. It is structurally more complex. It was built in less than 1/60th of the time, and not a single original blueprint, engineering specification, or design document from its construction has ever been found. This is a fact worth sitting with for a moment. The Roman Empire was, by any measure, one of the most administratively sophisticated civilizations in human history. Roman bureaucrats produced documents in staggering quantities: legal codes, census records, military supply manifests, property surveys, commercial contracts. The archives of Roman Egypt alone, preserved by the exceptional dryness of the desert climate, have yielded hundreds of thousands of papyrus documents covering everything from tax disputes to private letters to government procurement records. For a construction project of the Colosseum scale involving an estimated 100,000 workers, the quarrying and transport of approximately 100,000 cubic meters of travertine limestone from Tivoli, 25 kilometers outside Rome, the production of 300 tons of iron clamps, and a decade of continuous construction activity on one of the most prominent sites in the Imperial capital. The administrative paperwork alone should have filled a substantial archive. None of it survives. No construction contracts, no material inventories, no engineering calculations, no architect's name recorded with confidence in any primary source. The man or men who designed the Colosseum are, for practical purposes, anonymous. One theory suggests that the destruction of Rome's central administrative archives during the political upheavals of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, a period of near-continuous civil war, plague, and economic collapse known to historians as the Crisis of the 3rd century, accounts for the loss of most imperial construction records from the 1st and 2nd centuries. The fire that destroyed portions of the Palatine Hill administrative complex under Emperor Commodus in 191 AD is specifically cited by some scholars as a likely point of catastrophic document loss. But the absence of any surviving copy, any provincial duplicate, any reference in later sources to specific technical documents related to the Colosseum's construction, this is a silence that goes beyond ordinary archival attrition. It is, archaeologists have noted, a silence that looks almost total. In the absence of documents, researchers have turned to the building itself as its own archive. And what the building has revealed, particularly in the last 2 decades, has been genuinely startling. The Colosseum is built primarily from 3 materials: travertine limestone for the outer load-bearing structure, tufa volcanic rock for the inner walls, and opus caementitium Roman concrete for the vaulted ceilings, the foundations, and much of the internal structure. Roman concrete is not a modern rediscovery. Engineers and architects have known about it since the Renaissance, and its basic composition, a mixture of volcanic ash, lime, seawater, and aggregate, has been understood in general terms for centuries. What was not understood, until very recently, was what made it work as well as it does. In 2023, a research team led by Admir Masick, professor of civil and environmental engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, published a study in the journal Science Advances that fundamentally revised the scientific understanding of Roman concretes. The study focused on samples from ancient Roman structures, including the harbour at Caesarea Maritima, and several buildings in the Bay of Naples region, but its findings apply directly to the concrete used in large imperial construction projects of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, including the Colosseum. What Masick and his colleagues identified was a microstructural feature of Roman concrete that had never been properly characterized before the presence of small, bright white mineral formations distributed throughout the material, which the team identified as calcium-rich fragments of a specific type called limeclasts. For decades, these formations had been dismissed by researchers as evidence of sloppy mixing chunks of incompletely processed quicklime left in the concrete due to poor quality control. Masick's team discovered that this interpretation was exactly wrong. The limeclasts in Roman concrete are not defects. They are features. When water penetrates a crack in Roman concrete, as it inevitably does over centuries of weathering and seismic stress, the water interacts with the calcium-rich limeclasts at the crack surface. This interaction triggers a chemical reaction that produces new calcium carbonate crystals, which gradually fill the crack from the inside. The concrete, in other words, repairs itself. This process is slow by human standards. A crack 1 millimeter wide might take several decades to fully seal. But on the timescale of centuries, the timescale on which the Colosseum has been standing, the cumulative effect is significant. Modern concrete, which does not contain limeclasts, develops cracks that propagate and widen over time, eventually leading to structural failure. Roman concrete develops cracks that seal themselves, maintaining the integrity of the structure indefinitely. Lynn Lancaster, whose 2005 study concrete vaulted construction in Imperial Rome remains the standard reference work on Roman structural engineering, has noted in subsequent interviews that Masick's findings reframe the entire question of Roman engineering knowledge. The Romans did not accidentally produce self-healing concrete through careless mixing. The specific type of volcanic ash used pozzolana from the Phlegrean fields near Naples, selected over other available volcanic materials, and the specific temperature and processing method required to produce reactive limeclasts suggest a level of empirical knowledge about material chemistry that goes considerably beyond what any surviving Roman text describes. The Romans knew something. They demonstrated that knowledge in every major construction project of the imperial period, and they apparently did not write it down in any form that has reached us. Archaeologists have noted that this gap between demonstrated technical capability and documented technical knowledge is one of the defining puzzles of Roman engineering history. The concrete formula was used consistently across hundreds of structures spanning 3 centuries and the entire geographical extent of the empire. From Britain to Syria, consistency at that scale requires transmission. The knowledge had to be passed from one generation of builders to the next, from one region to another. It was not being rediscovered independently each time. How it was transmitted, and why the transmission left no legible written record, remains an open question. The concrete is not the only feature of the Colosseum's construction that resists straightforward explanation. The outer wall of the Colosseum is an ellipse, not a circle, not an oval, but a precise geometric ellipse with 2 focal points, a semi-major axis of approximately 88 meters and a semi-minor axis of approximately 56 meters. Constructing a true ellipse at this scale, in stone, requires either extremely precise surveying equipment or a sophisticated geometric construction method that can be executed accurately in the field. Robert Coate-Stevens of the British School at Rome, who has published extensively on Roman urban construction, has documented the surveying methods used in Roman building projects across the imperial period. The standard Roman surveying instrument, the groma, was adequate for establishing right angles and straight lines. For curved geometry of the complexity required by the Colosseum's elliptical plan, the groma alone would not have been sufficient. One theory suggests that Roman builders used a rope and stake method for laying out large ellipses, a technique known from classical geometry, in which 2 fixed stakes and a loop of rope of fixed length can be used to trace a perfect ellipse around them. This method works, and it requires no instruments beyond rope and stakes. But executing it accurately at the scale of the Colosseum, maintaining consistent focal distances across an 8-meter span, on uneven ground, with the precision required for a load-bearing stone structure, presents practical challenges that the theory does not fully resolve. What remains unexplained is a related anomaly identified in structural surveys of the Colosseum's outer wall. Several sections of the wall show angular deviations from the theoretical ellipse of approximately 0.3 degrees. These deviations are too consistent and too regularly spaced to be accidental. They appear, to researchers who have examined them, to be deliberate corrections built into the geometry to account for some factor that the standard ellipse formula does not capture. What that factor was, and how the builders identified the need for the correction without instruments capable of measuring it directly, is not currently understood. Return to the timeline for a moment. 10 years, 100,000 workers, 100,000 cubic meters of limestone, 300 tons of iron clamps, a self-healing concrete formula whose chemistry would not be scientifically characterized for 2,000 years. A precisely calculated elliptical geometry with deliberate angular corrections that have no documented rationale. A mechanical hypogeum of 80 elevator shafts, whose counterweight specifications survive nowhere in writing. An arena floor designed to be removed and replaced, and in some configurations to hold enough water to float warships. All of it built in 10 years. All of it built without any surviving record of how it was done. The Cologne Cathedral took 632 years, and its builders left thousands of documents, architectural drawings, correspondence between master builders, records of design changes, accounts of structural problems encountered and solved. The builders of the Colosseum left nothing. Or rather, and this distinction matters, nothing has been found. In 2019, archaeologists working near the Lateran Palace in Rome, less than a kilometre from the Colosseum, discovered a cache of late 1st century administrative documents during construction work for a new underground utility line. The documents were fragmentary and badly deteriorated. Most dealt with property records and tax assessments, but among them, researchers identified references to construction activity at a site described in the text by a phrase that translates roughly as the Great Amphitheatre of the Flavians. The fragments were too damaged to yield specific technical information, but they confirmed something important. The administrative record of the Colosseum's construction existed. Documents were created. Files were kept. They are somewhere. Possibly destroyed. Possibly still buried under the city that was built, century by century, on top of the world that built them. One theory suggests that the systematic excavation of late 1st century administrative sites within a 1 kilometre radius of the Colosseum sites that have never been fully investigated due to the presence of modern buildings above them would recover material that has not been seen since the fall of the Western Empire. That excavation has not been undertaken. The buildings above it are still standing, and the blueprint, if it exists, is still lost. In the summer of 1993, construction workers laying a new gas pipeline on the outskirts of Ephesus, the ancient Roman city on the western coast of what is now Turkey, struck something unexpected, approximately 2 meters below the surface. Not ruins, not pottery, not the mosaic floors or marble column fragments that routinely surface in that part of the world when machinery meets earth. Bones, hundreds of them, arranged in rows, buried with a consistency and a regularity that suggested not a mass grave, not a plague pit, not a battlefield, but something more deliberate, something that looked, to the archaeologists called in to assess the site, like a dedicated cemetery, a cemetery for a very specific kind of person. It took more than 2 decades of forensic analysis, bone density measurements, isotope studies, trauma pattern mapping, and eventually ancient DNA extraction before the full picture of who these people were began to emerge. What that picture revealed about the lives of Roman gladiators, about the reality of arena combat, and about the distance between historical fact and 2,000 years of accumulated mythology, is one of the most significant forensic archaeology findings of the past 30 years. And it contradicts, in almost every important detail, what Hollywood has told us gladiators were. The site outside Ephesus is now understood to be one of the largest and best preserved gladiatorial cemeteries ever discovered. By the time excavations were substantially complete in the mid-2000s, researchers had identified the remains of approximately 68 individuals, the majority of whom showed skeletal profiles consistent with professional combat-healed trauma, unusual bone density, and in several cases, evidence of surgical intervention on injuries that would have been life-threatening without medical treatment. The lead forensic analyst on the project was Fabian Kanz, a physical anthropologist at the Medical University of Vienna. Kanz and his team spent years conducting systematic skeletal analysis on the Ephesus remains, publishing their core findings in a series of papers between 2004 and 2014. The picture that emerged from that analysis was not what anyone had anticipated. The first surprise was the diet. Stable isotope analysis of the bone collagen from the Ephesus skeletons revealed a dietary profile dominated almost entirely by plant-based foods, specifically high quantities of barley and legumes with very low levels of animal protein. This was not the diet of warriors. It was the diet of endurance athletes. The Roman physician Galen, who worked at a gladiatorial training school in Pergamon in the 2nd century AD, and whose medical writings survive in substantial form, actually mentions this dietary practice, describing gladiators as being fattened on barley. For a long time, scholars interpreted this as rhetorical contempt. The isotope data from Ephesus suggests Galen was describing a genuine nutritional strategy. The high-carbohydrate, plant-based diet produced a specific physiological effect: a thick layer of subcutaneous body fat overlying the muscle tissue. Archaeologists have noted that this fat layer served a precise combat function. Shallow cuts, the kind most likely to be inflicted in a controlled gladiatorial bout, would bleed dramatically and visibly, satisfying the audience's appetite for spectacle without penetrating to the muscle tissue or vital organs beneath. The gladiator could absorb what looked from 50 rows up like a devastating wound and continue fighting. This was not accidental. It was engineered. The second surprise from the Ephesus analysis was the trauma pattern. When Kanz and his team mapped the injuries visible in the skeletal remains, both healed injuries from earlier in the individuals' lives and the perimortem injuries associated with their deaths, a clear pattern emerged that cut against the popular image of gladiatorial combat as chaotic, brutal, and indiscriminate. The wounds were consistent. They fell into recognizable categories. They showed evidence of tactical restraint. The majority of combat injuries in the Ephesus skeletons were located on the left side of the body, the side presented to an opponent in standard fighting stance. They were concentrated in predictable target zones. Many showed evidence of having been deliberately non-lethal cuts and punctures that damaged tissue without striking arteries or organs. And a significant proportion of the skeletal remains showed evidence of healed trauma from multiple previous injuries, meaning that these individuals had survived repeated combat engagements before their final one. One theory suggests that gladiatorial combat in the Roman arena operated under a much more structured set of rules and conventions than ancient literary sources, which tend toward dramatic exaggeration, make immediately apparent. The evidence from Ephesus suggests that skilled, popular gladiators were commercial assets of considerable value, that the owners and promoters of gladiatorial games had strong financial incentives to keep experienced fighters alive, and that the contests themselves may have been calibrated through agreed conventions between fighters and through the intervention of referees visible in several artistic depictions of arena combat to produce dramatic spectacle without necessarily producing death. What remains unexplained is the precise nature of those conventions. No rulebook for gladiatorial combat survives. No official record of referee judgments or contest protocols has been found. What we have are the bones of the men who fought, and the bones suggest a level of professional discipline and survivability that the phrase bread and circuses does not begin to capture. The third element of the Ephesus picture is, in some ways, the most remarkable. Several of the skulls in the gladiatorial cemetery showed evidence of cranial surgery, specifically the removal of bone fragments from penetrating head wounds, a procedure known as trepanation. The surgical work was clean, precise, and in several cases demonstrably successful. The bone showed healing around the surgical margins, meaning the patient survived the operation and lived for some period afterward. This is not surprising in itself. Trepanation was practiced across many ancient cultures. What is surprising is the quality and consistency of the work. Galen of Pergamon, who served as physician to the gladiatorial school operated by the high priest of Asia in the 2nd century AD, is one of the most documented medical figures of the ancient world. His surviving writings fill 20 volumes in their standard modern edition. Among the many subjects he addresses is the treatment of gladiatorial injuries, and his descriptions reveal a level of surgical sophistication that medical historians have found genuinely difficult to place in its historical context. Galen describes procedures for managing penetrating abdominal wounds, including the replacement of prolapsed intestines and the closure of abdominal cavities that would not appear again in European medical literature until the Renaissance. He describes the debridement of infected wounds using techniques that anticipate the principles of antiseptic surgery by 17 centuries. He describes the use of wine as a wound cleaning agent, a practice that is, as modern microbiology confirms, genuinely effective at reducing bacterial contamination. The surgical findings at Ephesus are consistent with Galen's descriptions. The trepanation work, in particular, shows a level of technical precision that Kans's team found difficult to account for without assuming the systematic transmission of refined surgical knowledge through the gladiatorial training school system. One theory suggests that the gladiatorial schools of the Roman Empire, the Ludi, of which the Ludus Magnus, adjacent to the Colosseum in Rome, was the largest, functioned not only as combat training facilities, but as the primary institutional locus for advanced medical knowledge in the Roman world. The volume and variety of trauma that gladiatorial physicians encountered in daily practice would have provided an unparalleled clinical education unavailable anywhere else in the ancient world. If this theory is correct, then the arena was not only a machine for producing spectacle, it was, simultaneously, a medical school, and the knowledge developed in that school, the surgical techniques documented by Galen and confirmed by the bones at Ephesus, largely failed to survive the collapse of the institution that had generated it. Perhaps no aspect of gladiatorial combat has been more consistently misrepresented in popular culture than the death rate, the image burned into the collective imagination by decades of films and television. The helpless loser sprawled in the sand, the crowd baying for blood, the thumb turned down, the sword across the throat implies that arena combat was a reliable and frequent path to death. The gladiator, in this version of history, was essentially a condemned man performing his own execution for an audience. The forensic and documentary evidence suggests otherwise. Kans's analysis of the Ephesus remains found that the majority of combat deaths in the cemetery were caused by a single, decisive blow, typically a hammer strike to the skull, consistent with the coup de grace delivered by the victorious fighter or the arena official at the conclusion of a lost bout. This pattern is inconsistent with deaths resulting from the cumulative trauma of a prolonged, uncontrolled fight. It is consistent with a formal execution of a defeated opponent who had already surrendered or been rendered incapable of continuing. More significantly, the Ephesus skeletons show a ratio of healed injuries to fatal injuries that implies substantial survival across multiple contests. These were not men who fought once and died. Many of them fought repeatedly, over years, and survived. Documentary evidence supports this picture. Financial records and inscriptions from the Roman period, analysed by historian Veal in his 1981 study La Gladiature en Occident, and more recently by historian Fick Meyer in The Gladiators, published in 2003, suggest that a skilled, experienced gladiator represented a capital investment equivalent to a luxury property. Arena promoters, the editores who funded the games, paid substantial sums to hire experienced fighters from training schools, and the contracts typically included penalty clauses if a fighter was killed through negligence or mismanagement. Archaeologists have noted that several gladiatorial epitaphs surviving from across the Roman Empire record fighters who competed in 20, 30, or even more than 50 bouts over careers spanning a decade or longer. These are not the careers of men being fed to lions on a monthly basis. One theory suggests that the perception of gladiatorial combat as routinely lethal was cultivated deliberately both by Roman-era sources writing for audiences who wanted drama and by early Christian writers for whom the arena represented a convenient symbol of pagan barbarism. The gap between the performed spectacle of danger and the actuarial reality of gladiatorial mortality may have been, in both periods, a gap that served somebody's interests to maintain. What remains unexplained is how completely that narrative succeeded. For 2,000 years, across every medium from historiography to cinema, the gladiator has been defined by his death. The bones at Ephesus tell a more complicated story of professional athletes, skilled surgeons, nutritional scientists, and combat specialists, operating inside an institution of extraordinary sophistication. There is one final detail from the Ephesus cemetery that deserves attention. Among the grave markers recovered from the site, several bore inscriptions, names, records of fights won and lost, dedications from family members or fellow fighters. One inscription, partially damaged but legible, records a fighter named Aptus, who is described as having survived 34 bouts before his death. The dedication on his grave was placed by his familia, not his blood family, but his cohort of fellow gladiators from the same training school. The word used in the inscription for this group is a word that in standard Latin denotes a household, a community, a unit of people bound by shared obligation and shared experience. Aptus did not die alone in the sand, forgotten by everyone who watched him. He was mourned, commemorated, and remembered by name by men who had trained beside him, eaten the same barley diet, survived the same surgical interventions, and fought on the same sand. He was, by any reasonable definition of the word, a professional, and the institution that made him one was the same institution that the Roman Empire built in every province and every conquered territory. To demonstrate the reach of its power, the arena was never just about death, it was about the performance of life, at its most extreme, in front of as many witnesses as possible. And it turns out the performers were considerably harder to kill than the audience was meant to believe. In the year 64 AD, Rome burned. The fire that consumed large portions of the city over 9 days in July of that year remains one of the most debated events in Roman history. Ancient sources disagree on its cause, its extent, and its consequences. What they largely agree on is what happened next. Emperor Nero, who had ruled Rome since 54 AD, used the destruction as an opportunity. On the cleared land left by the fire, in the heart of the most densely populated and historically significant district of the imperial capital, he built himself a palace. Not a palace in the conventional sense. What Nero constructed on the ruins of central Rome was a complex so vast, so deliberately extravagant, and so comprehensively private that ancient sources struggle to find adequate language for it. They called it the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, and at its centre, where the valley between the Esquiline, Caelian, and Palatine hills had once held a neighbourhood of ordinary Roman streets and buildings, Nero excavated an artificial lake, a private lake, in the middle of Rome, for one man. 14 years later, that lake no longer existed. In its place stood the Colosseum, and the man who put it there understood exactly what he was doing. Vespasian became Emperor of Rome in 69 AD, at the end of a catastrophic year that had seen 3 other men hold the same title in rapid succession: Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, each elevated by a different faction of the military, and each removed by violence. Vespasian was a soldier from a non-aristocratic family, a practical man with no particular claim to dynastic legitimacy, and a very clear understanding that his hold on power depended entirely on his ability to project authority convincingly. The Domus Aurea presented him with both a problem and an opportunity. The problem was symbolic. Nero's Golden House occupied the geographic centre of Rome, the valley that had historically been public land, accessible to all citizens, and had converted it into a private pleasure garden, visible to no one except the emperor and his guests. The Roman historian Suetonius records that ordinary Romans, upon first seeing the completed complex, circulated a bitter joke that Rome had become a single house, and Romans had better emigrate to Veii, a neighbouring town, before that house consumed everything. The opportunity was equally symbolic. By demolishing the Domus Aurea and returning its land to public use, a new emperor could position himself in a single architectural gesture as the antithesis of Nero, a ruler who gave back what his predecessor had taken, who replaced private excess with public spectacle, who transformed a monument to one man's ego into a gift for the entire Roman people. Vespasian drained Nero's lake. He demolished the palace wings that surrounded it, and on the drained lake bed, in approximately 70 AD, he began construction of the largest amphitheatre the world had ever seen. The Colosseum was not, in its deepest conception, an entertainment venue. It was an act of political theatre so carefully calculated that it is still working 2,000 years later. We are still, in every documentary and history book and tourist guide, describing the Colosseum as a gift from the emperor to the people of Rome, using almost exactly the language that Vespasian's own propaganda apparatus generated to announce it. A fragment of the original dedicatory inscription from the Colosseum was rediscovered and partially reconstructed by the Italian epigrapher Geza Alfoldi in 1995, working from holes left in the stone by the iron letters of the original text, letters that had been pried out and melted down centuries earlier. Alfoldi's reconstruction, published in the journal Zeitschrift für Papyrologie und Epigraphik, revealed that the original inscription credited Vespasian with building the amphitheatre Ex Manubius from the spoils of war. The specific spoils referenced were the proceeds from the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD, carried out by Vespasian's son Titus, which funded the construction directly. This detail is not incidental. It is the entire message. The Colosseum was built with Jewish gold on the site of a tyrant's private pleasure ground as a gift to the Roman people by a general who had just demonstrated Rome's military supremacy over a rebellious province. Every element of that sentence was visible to every Roman who attended the inaugural games in 80 AD. The building was not just an arena, it was a three-dimensional political statement that could be read from every seat in the house. Archaeologists have noted that the placement of the Imperial box within the Colosseum's seating plan is itself a precise piece of political engineering. The box sat at the point of the arena's short axis, the position that provides the most geometrically centered view of the elliptical fighting floor. But more significantly, it was positioned so that from any seat in all four tiers of the Colosseum, the emperor in his box was visible, not partially visible. Visible as a natural and unavoidable feature of the sightline from your assigned seat. Valerie Higgins, of the British School at Rome, has described this arrangement as a surveillance architecture operating in both directions simultaneously. The emperor watched the crowd watched the emperor, and the crowd watched each other watching the emperor. 50,000 people gathered in a space engineered so that everyone was always in full view of everyone else, with the emperor at the geometric center of the entire visual field. This was not stadium design. This was social control. Vespasian died in 79 AD, 1 year before the Colosseum was completed. His son Titus oversaw the inaugural games in 80 AD and received the public credit for the building's completion. The historical record of Vespasian's death is, depending on which ancient source you consult, either unremarkable or deeply suspicious. Suetonius records that Vespasian died of natural causes, a fever, complicated by excessive use of cold baths. He was 69 years old, which was a respectable age for any Roman, let alone one who had spent decades on military campaigns. The account is plausible. It is also, as several modern historians have pointed out, almost completely unverifiable. What is verifiable is the timeline. Vespasian died in June of 79 AD. Titus assumed sole power immediately, without any of the political turbulence that had accompanied every imperial succession since the death of Augustus. Mount Vesuvius erupted in August of 79 AD, 2 months after Titus took power, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum and killing an estimated 16,000 people. Titus's response to the disaster, rapid, generous, extensively documented in the historical record, established him almost immediately as a popular and capable ruler. The speed of his consolidation of power, the smoothness of the transition, and the convenient timing of a natural disaster that allowed him to demonstrate his qualities as a crisis leader within weeks of taking the throne. These things are historically documented facts, not conspiracy theories. One theory suggests they are also coincidences. Another theory suggests they are not. Ancient sources, including the historian Philostratus' record, rumors circulating in Rome during Titus's reign, that he had played a role in accelerating his father's death. These rumors were never substantiated. Titus died himself in 81 AD, after only 2 years in power, under circumstances that Suetonius describes as similarly ambiguous, and the emperor who succeeded him, his brother Domitian, was widely reported in ancient sources to have had both the motive and the means to hasten his brother's end. What remains unexplained is why the smoothest imperial succession in a generation happened to coincide with the completion of the most politically significant building project in Roman history, and why the man who received public credit for that building's completion died before he could fully exploit the political capital it represented. The Colosseum outlasted everyone who built it. It outlasted the dynasty that commissioned it. It outlasted the empire itself. Whatever the private calculations of the men who put it there, the building absorbed them all and continued standing. There is a detail about the Colosseum's physical layout that guides rarely mention, and that most visitors walk past without noticing. The arena had two primary ground-level entrances, opening directly onto the fighting floor. One was the Porta Triumphalis, the Gate of Triumph, through which gladiators entered the arena before a contest. The other was the Porta Libertinensis, named for Libitina, the Roman goddess of funerals and corpses through which the dead and defeated were carried out. These two gates were not, as one might expect, positioned on opposite sides of the arena. They were positioned at the two ends of the arena's long axis, facing each other directly across the fighting floor. Every person who entered the Colosseum through the Porta Triumphalis was therefore looking, from the moment they stepped onto the sand, directly at the gate through which they might leave it. Archaeologists have noted that this arrangement is unlikely to have been accidental. The Colosseum's architects demonstrated, in every other aspect of the building's design, a precise and deliberate attention to the symbolic and psychological dimensions of spatial arrangement. The alignment of entry and exit, life and death, triumph and removal facing each other across the arena floor was a statement about the nature of the spectacle that was about to unfold in that space. It was also, Valerie Higgins has argued, a statement about power. The emperor, seated in his imperial box at the midpoint between the two gates, occupied the position of literal and symbolic arbiter, the figure whose gesture determined which gate you would leave through. This was not metaphorical. The emperor's missio, his decision to grant mercy to a defeated gladiator, was the mechanism that determined the outcome of a bout whose conclusion was otherwise in doubt. 50,000 witnesses, one decision-maker. The entire architecture of the building oriented to make that relationship unmistakable. One theory suggests that the genius of the Colosseum, as a political instrument, lay precisely in this compression, in the way it took the abstract relationship between imperial power and individual fate, and made it visible, tangible, and repeatable 50,000 times per session, hundreds of sessions per year, for 4 centuries. The gladiator standing at the Porta Triumphalis, looking across the sand at the Porta Libertinensis, was not simply an athlete about to compete. He was a living demonstration of a political truth that the emperor needed his people to understand and internalize. The emperor decided who lived. The emperor decided who died. And 200 million people across the Roman Empire learned this lesson not from a proclamation or a law or a philosophical treatise, but from watching it happen in person in a building specifically designed to make the lesson impossible to misunderstand. In 1995, the Italian government commissioned a structural assessment of the Colosseum's foundations. The building had been showing signs of differential settlement, subtle but measurable variations in the way different sections of the outer wall were responding to the weight above them. After the 1349 earthquake that had collapsed the entire southern outer wall, and after centuries of stone quarrying that had removed an estimated 2/3 of the Colosseum's original material, the structural integrity of what remained had become a matter of ongoing engineering concern. The assessment was routine, professional, and intended to produce a straightforward report on foundation stability. What it produced instead was a question that the Italian archaeological establishment has been quietly debating ever since. Giorgio Croce, professor of structural engineering at the University of Rome La Sapienza, and one of the most respected specialists in the preservation of historic monuments in Europe, led the assessment team. Croce had worked on structural projects at the Colosseum before. He knew the building's engineering history in considerable detail. What he did not expect to find, when his team began taking core samples from the foundation zone beneath the outer wall, was evidence of construction activity at a depth and in a configuration that the known building history of the site could not account for. Beneath the Colosseum's foundations, Croce's team identified structural remains that predated the Flavian construction of 70 to 80 AD, not just the traces of Nero's lake basin, whose existence was already documented, something that had been built, used, and then deliberately buried before the Colosseum's foundations were laid over it. An earlier city, underneath the building that replaced it. To understand what Croce found, it is necessary to understand what the valley between the Esquiline, Caelian, and Palatine hills looked like before Nero's lake existed. The valley was not empty land. It was not an undeveloped peripheral zone. It was, for several centuries before the Julio-Claudian period, one of the most densely inhabited neighborhoods in Rome, a district of workshops, apartment blocks, small temples, and commercial premises that sat at the intersection of several major pedestrian routes through the city. The Roman historian Livy and the geographer Strabo both reference settlement in this valley in the Republican period, centuries before the Empire. Ceramic surveys conducted by researchers from the British School at Rome in the late 1990s, including work by Robert Coates Stevens, have recovered pottery fragments from the valley's subsurface layers, dating to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, nearly 300 years before Vespasian broke ground on the Colosseum. When Nero began construction of the Domus Aurea complex after the fire of 64 AD, the neighborhood that occupied this valley was demolished and buried. The residents, their number unknown, their displacement unrecorded in any surviving source, were simply erased from the documentary record along with their homes. Nero's engineers filled the valley, leveled the surface, excavated the lake basin, and built over whatever had been there before. When Vespasian drained the lake and began the Colosseum, he built on top of Nero's fill layers, which were themselves on top of the buried Republican-era neighborhood. The Colosseum's foundations therefore rest not on bedrock or on a single prepared surface, but on a stratified sequence of human occupation going back at least 3 centuries before the building's construction. Croce's 1995 assessment confirmed this stratigraphy in structural terms. The foundation anomalies he identified variations in settlement behavior that could not be explained by the Flavian construction alone were consistent with the presence of earlier buried structures at depth, structures whose differential compaction over 2,000 years was producing the subtle but measurable movements in the wall above. 20 years after Croce's structural assessment, the technology available for subsurface investigation had advanced considerably. In 2015, a research team from the Politecnico di Milano, working under a research agreement with the Colosseum Archaeological Park and with partial funding from the Italian Ministry of Cultural Heritage, conducted a comprehensive ground-penetrating radar survey of the entire footprint of the Colosseum and its immediate surroundings. Ground-penetrating radar, GPR, uses pulses of electromagnetic energy directed into the ground to produce reflected signals that allow researchers to identify subsurface anomalies, voids, and structural features without excavation. The Milan team's survey was the most technically sophisticated, non-invasive investigation of the Colosseum's subsurface ever undertaken. It covered the full interior of the building, the foundation zone beneath the outer walls, and a perimeter extending approximately 30 meters beyond the outer wall on all sides. The results, presented in preliminary form at the 2016 conference of the Associazione Italiana di Archeologia and subsequently described in partial form in the journal Archaeological Prospection, identified 3 distinct layers of subsurface structural activity beneath the Colosseum's current foundation level. The first layer corresponded to the known hypogeum, the Flavian-era underground network already documented by previous excavations. This was expected. The second layer, approximately 4 to 6 meters below the hypogeum floor, showed GPR signatures consistent with earlier construction walls, floor surfaces, and what appeared to be a network of smaller chambers arranged in a pattern different from the Flavian grid above. The dimensions and orientation of these features were inconsistent with the Colosseum's own structural logic. They appeared to belong to a different building or set of buildings from an earlier period. The Milan team's interpretation, offered cautiously in their preliminary report, was that these features represented the buried remains of the pre-Neronian neighborhood, the Republican-era structures that had been built over, first by Nero and then by Vespasian. The third layer was different in character from both of the layers above it. At a depth of approximately 9 to 12 meters below the current hypogeum floor, well below any structure that could be associated with the Flavian construction or even with Nero's lake excavation, the GPR survey identified a series of anomalies whose nature the Milan team declined to, characterized definitively in their preliminary report. And they appeared, from the GPR signatures, to represent void spaces rather than solid construction hollow volumes beneath the city, at a depth that should, by any conventional understanding of Roman urban development in this district, contain nothing but undisturbed natural substrate. What remains unexplained is what those voids are. One partial explanation for the deep anomalies identified in the 2015 GPR survey comes from a direction that few people associate with the Colosseum: water management. The valley between Rome's central hills was, in its natural state, a floodplain. The same topographic features that made it an attractive location for settlement, its position at a natural convergence of pedestrian routes, its relatively flat ground, its accessibility from multiple directions also made it prone to seasonal flooding from the streams that drained the surrounding hillsides into the valley floor. The Romans addressed this problem very early in their urban development of the site, constructing drainage channels that directed water away from the valley floor and into the Tiber. The most significant of these early drainage works was the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain, whose construction is traditionally dated to the reign of the Etruscan king Tarquinius Superbus in the 6th century BC, though modern archaeological evidence suggests a more gradual development over several centuries. Coates-Stephens, in his research on pre-imperial infrastructure in the central Roman Valley, has documented evidence of drainage channels in the Colosseum district that appear to predate the Republican-era neighborhood by a significant margin. These channels, identified primarily through ceramic dating of the fill material within them and through their structural relationship to later construction, belong to an early phase of Roman urban drainage that the standard histories of the Cloaca Maxima system do not fully account for. One theory suggests that the deep void anomalies identified by the Milan GPR survey in 2015 represent sections of this early drainage network. Large-bore tunnels cut into the natural substrate of the valley floor in the archaic period of Roman urban development, possibly as early as the 7th or 6th century BC, and subsequently sealed, forgotten, and built over by every succeeding phase of construction above them. If this theory is correct, then beneath the Colosseum, beneath the gladiatorial hypogeum, beneath the buried Republican neighborhood, beneath the fill layers of Nero's lake, there are tunnels that were old when Rome was young, tunnels that have not been entered or mapped or examined in possibly 2,500 years. Archaeologists have noted that the GPR signatures for large hollow spaces can be produced by several different types of subsurface feature, and that the Milan team's identification of the deep anomalies as void spaces rather than solid construction, while technically well supported by the data, requires confirmation through physical investigation before definitive conclusions can be drawn. That physical investigation has not taken place. Here is where the documented facts become, for some observers, uncomfortable. The 2015 GPR survey produced findings that, by the Milan team's own assessment, warranted follow-up investigation. The preliminary report explicitly recommended a program of targeted micro-excavation at 3 specific locations within the Colosseum footprint locations, where the combination of the second-layer structural anomalies and the third-layer void signatures was most pronounced, and where the research team judged that limited physical investigation could be conducted without compromising the Colosseum's structural integrity or visitor access. That recommendation was submitted to the Soprintendenza Speciale di Roma, the governmental authority responsible for the Colosseum's management and preservation, in late 2015. As of the time of this documentary's research, the recommended micro-excavation program has not been approved. The Soprintendenza has not, in any public statement, explained the reason for the delay. The standard administrative explanation for extended review periods in Italian heritage management, the complexity of balancing research access against preservation requirements and visitor management needs, is legitimate and applies, genuinely, to many cases. The Colosseum is one of the most visited sites on Earth, receiving approximately 7 million visitors per year. The logistical and liability considerations involved in conducting subsurface excavation in an actively visited monument are real and substantial. What remains unexplained is why the specific question of the deep anomalies, the third-layer void signatures that the Milan team identified at 9 to 12 meters depth, well below any zone that could be affected by visitor activity or structural intervention, has not been addressed through any of the several non-invasive investigation methods that would not require physical excavation at all. Further GPR passes at higher resolution, seismic tomography, muon radiography, a technique that uses naturally occurring cosmic ray particles to image subsurface density variations, recently applied successfully to the investigation of hidden chambers in the Great Pyramid of Giza and in the Neapolitan tufa caverns beneath Naples. None of these methods require a single shovel to be put in the ground. None of them have been applied to the deep anomaly zone beneath the Colosseum. One theory suggests that the absence of further investigation reflects nothing more than the ordinary institutional inertia of a large heritage bureaucracy managing too many competing priorities with too few resources. This is a reasonable theory, and it may well be correct. Another theory suggests that the decision about what to investigate beneath the Colosseum, and when, and by whom, is not purely a scientific or administrative decision, that the political and institutional dimensions of what might be found at depth beneath Rome's most visited monument are a factor in determining what questions get asked, and what questions remain, for the time being, unasked. This second theory is harder to evaluate because the evidence for it is largely the absence of evidence, the gap between what the technology could reveal and what it has been directed to reveal. Archaeologists have noted that this gap is not unique to the Colosseum. Across Rome, a city built on 3,000 years of continuous human occupation, subsurface investigation has consistently produced findings that complicate the official historical narrative in ways that require either revision of established interpretations or active management of public expectations. The relationship between archaeological research and institutional heritage management in Rome is, by any dispassionate assessment, complicated. Beneath the Colosseum, at a depth that no human being has reached in perhaps 25 centuries, something is there. What it is, who put it there, and when it was last seen by living eyes. These are questions that the technology to answer exists, and that have not yet been asked. On a January morning in 404 AD, a monk walked into the Colosseum and tried to stop a gladiatorial contest. His name, according to the 5th century ecclesiastical historian Theodoret of Cyrus, was Telemachus. He was, Theodoret writes, an Eastern monk, a man from the ascetic tradition of the Egyptian and Syrian desert fathers who had travelled to Rome specifically because he believed the gladiatorial games were an abomination incompatible with the Christian empire that Rome had, at least nominally, become. He entered the arena during an active contest, descended to the arena floor, and attempted to physically separate the two fighters. The crowd killed him. They stoned him to death on the sand, according to Theodoret, in full view of the assembled audience. And then in Theodoret's account, the Christian emperor Honorius, moved by the monk's martyrdom, issued an edict banning gladiatorial combat throughout the Roman Empire. It is a powerful story. It has the clean narrative arc of a moral parable, a lone righteous man, a violent crowd, a sudden conversion of imperial will, an institution abolished. It is the story that most histories of the Colosseum tell when they reach the end of the gladiatorial games. It is also, according to two of the most respected classical historians of the 20th century, almost certainly not the complete picture. Keith Hopkins, professor of ancient history at Cambridge University until his death in 2004, spent much of his career examining the economic and demographic foundations of Roman spectacle. His 1983 book, Death and Renewal, co-authored with sociologist Graham Burton, remains one of the most cited works on the social function of Roman arena games. He was a quantitative historian with a particular interest in what the numbers behind historical narratives actually reveal. Mary Beard, also of Cambridge, whose 2016 book SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome, brought Roman history to a mainstream audience of millions, has written extensively on the gap between Roman self-representation and Roman historical reality. Both Hopkins and Beard, independently and through different methodological approaches, arrived at the same conclusion about the end of the gladiatorial games. The games were already dying before Telemachus walked onto the sand. Hopkins's analysis of the economic records, fragmentary as they are, suggests that the cost of staging gladiatorial games had been escalating steadily since the 2nd century AD, driven by the increasing scarcity of trained fighters, the rising price of wild animals, imported from an empire whose territorial reach was contracting, and the growing difficulty of recruiting prisoners of war in sufficient numbers to supply the arena's demand for combatants. By the late 3rd century, the financial burden of maintaining a full gladiatorial program had become unsustainable for many of the regional cities and municipalities that had previously hosted regular games. Beard's analysis focuses on the cultural and religious shift already underway within Roman society before Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 AD officially ended the persecution of Christians. The Christian community in Rome had been large, organized, and publicly influential for decades before Constantine. The moral critique of arena spectacle not only from Christians, but from Stoic philosophers and from elements of the Roman educated class who had always maintained a certain ambivalence about the games had been building in Roman intellectual life since at least the 1st century AD. Seneca, writing in the 1st century, described the midday executions in the arena as more brutal and more morally degrading than the gladiatorial contests themselves. One theory suggests that Telemachus, in Theodoret's account, is performing a narrative function rather than a historical one, that his story, whether literally true or not, provided the Christian ecclesiastical tradition with a clean origin point for the abolition of the games, locating moral agency in a Christian martyr, rather than in the grinding economic and demographic pressures that had been eroding the institution for generations. What remains unexplained is why Theodoret is the only source for the Telemachus story. Neither the secular historians of the period nor the imperial administrative records that survive from Honorius's reign make any reference to the incident or to the specific edict that Theodoret claims it prompted. An imperial edict banning gladiatorial combat throughout the Roman Empire would have been a document of significant administrative consequence, requiring transmission to every provincial governor and urban magistrate in the Western Empire. No copy of such an edict survives. The standard narrative of Christian Rome's relationship with the Colosseum begins with Constantine, the emperor who legalized Christianity in 313 AD, and who, in the decades that followed, progressively reshaped Roman public life around Christian values. Constantine's actual record on arena spectacle is considerably more ambiguous than the standard narrative suggests. He did ban crucifixion as a form of capital punishment, a reform with obvious Christian symbolic significance. He did issue edicts limiting certain categories of criminal sentence to arena combat, but he did not ban gladiatorial games. He did not close the amphitheatres, and in at least 2 documented instances recorded in the legal compilation known as the Codex Theodosianus, his administration issued rulings that regulated and implicitly legitimized the continued operation of gladiatorial schools. Archaeologists have noted that the physical evidence from the Colosseum itself is consistent with continued active use well into the 5th century. Graffiti identified in the hypogeum corridors, analysed by epigraphers from the Sapienza University of Rome, includes text that has been dated on paleographic grounds to the late 4th and early 5th centuries, inscriptions recording the names of fighters and the outcomes of bouts, exactly the kind of record-keeping associated with active arena management. The arena continued to function after Constantine. It continued to function after the formal division of the empire in 395 AD. It appears to have continued functioning, in some capacity, until sometime in the early 5th century, at which point the record goes quiet, not with a bang but with a gradual diminuendo that the surviving sources do not adequately document. One theory suggests that the games did not end with an edict at all, that they simply became too expensive, too logistically demanding, and too culturally marginal to sustain, and that they faded out of the Colosseum's programming over a period of decades, rather than stopping on a specific date in response to a specific event. This theory is less satisfying as a story than the martyrdom of Telemachus. It is, however, considerably better supported by the evidence. Whatever the precise date and mechanism of the game's end, what happened to the Colosseum afterward is documented, and what it reveals about the relationship between the Christian Church and the building that had defined pagan Rome for 4 centuries is more complex than simple condemnation. The Church did not demolish the Colosseum. It did something more interesting. It consumed it. The process began gradually in the 5th century and accelerated sharply in the medieval period. The Colosseum's travertine limestone, quarried at enormous expense from Tivoli, transported to Rome, and fitted into the outer walls with extraordinary precision, turned out to be an almost perfect building material for the churches, palaces, and civic buildings of Christian Rome. It was already cut, already shaped, already on site, and in the absence of any functioning authority capable of preventing its removal, entirely available. Historians estimate that over the course of the medieval period, approximately 100,000 tons of travertine were removed from the Colosseum and repurposed. The material went into the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. It went into the Palazzo Venezia. It went into the Palazzo della Cancelleria. It went into dozens of smaller churches across the city. The Colosseum did not disappear, it was disaggregated, redistributed, and reincorporated into the physical fabric of Christian Rome. Mary Beard has observed that this process of material reuse was not merely practical, it was also symbolic. The stone that had supported the spectacles of pagan Rome was literally being reused to build the houses of Christian worship. The empire's most potent symbol of pre-Christian power was being, block by block, converted. One theory suggests this conversion was not entirely unconscious, that the decision to source building material from the Colosseum specifically, rather than from the many other abandoned Roman structures available in the city, reflected a deliberate ecclesiastical policy of symbolic appropriation. By building churches from Colosseum stone, the church was not just recycling a convenient material, it was making a theological statement about the relationship between the old Rome and the new one. In the medieval period, a new narrative attached itself to the Colosseum, one that would ultimately save the building from complete dismantlement. The story that Christians had been martyred in the Colosseum, fed to lions, executed in the arena for their faith became, by the early medieval period, so widely accepted that the building was declared a sacred site, its soil consecrated by the blood of saints, its stones not to be further removed out of respect for the holy dead. Pope Benedict XIV formally consecrated the Colosseum in 1749, dedicating it to the memory of Christian martyrs and erecting the Stations of the Cross within the arena. The tradition of the papal Via Crucis, the Way of the Cross procession, held at the Colosseum every Good Friday, continues to this day, drawing hundreds of thousands of participants annually. The historical evidence for larger-scale Christian martyrdom, specifically within the Colosseum, is, however, considerably weaker than the tradition implies. The Colosseum did host public executions. Condemned criminals, including members of minority religious groups, were certainly killed in Roman arenas during the period of Christian persecution. But the specific and systematic execution of Christians as a matter of imperial policy is, as Keith Hopkins demonstrated in his analysis of the primary sources, considerably less well documented than the martyrological tradition suggests. Hopkins estimated, in a 1998 paper that generated significant controversy in both academic and religious circles, that the total number of Christians killed in Roman arenas across the entire empire during all periods of persecution was probably in the hundreds rather than the thousands, a significant number, but not the apocalyptic scale implied by centuries of martyrological literature. For the Colosseum specifically, no contemporary source records the execution of named Christian martyrs within the building during its active period. The association between the Colosseum and Christian martyrdom appears to have developed primarily in the early medieval period, as the building's original function faded from living memory and its massive, ruined presence in the center of the city invited the kind of mythologizing that fills the spaces left by lost documentation. Archaeologists have noted that the physical evidence from the Colosseum's arena floor and hypogeum does not specifically support or contradict the martyrdom tradition. The bones of the executed were not preserved, the documentary record is silent, and the archaeological record is ambiguous in ways that cannot be resolved without evidence that does not currently exist. What remains unexplained is why the martyrdom tradition became so firmly established so quickly, and why, once established, it proved so resistant to the documentary skepticism that scholars like Hopkins and Beard brought to bear on it. Without Benedict XIV's consecration and the sanctity it conferred, the stone quarrying that had already removed two-thirds of the Colosseum's original material would likely have continued until nothing remained. The church, in other words, dismantled the Colosseum for centuries and then saved it. One theory suggests this sequence was not accidental, that the Colosseum, stripped of its marble and its movable assets, reduced to a skeletal ruin whose stone was feeding the construction projects of Christian Rome, was declared sacred at precisely the moment when declaring it sacred cost nothing, and preserved something that had, by that point, become too iconic to lose entirely. The building that had been Rome's instrument of social control became, in its ruin, Christianity's most powerful symbol of redemptive suffering. The machine was repurposed, the message was changed, but the walls, or what remained of them, were finally allowed to stand. In the summer of 2009, A team of archaeologists working in a rain-soaked field on the southeastern coast of England made a discovery that one of them later described as the last thing he expected to find in that particular patch of ground. Not coins, not pottery, not the foundations of a Roman garrison building or the remnants of a supply depot, the kinds of finds that routinely surface at Richborough. The site in Kent, where the Roman legions of Emperor Claudius made their initial landing on British soil in 43 AD, beginning the conquest of a province that Rome would hold for nearly 4 centuries. What Tony Wilmot found, emerging from beneath 9 feet of collapsed earth and debris in the interior of a massive earthwork mound that local people had been walking past for generations without giving it particular attention, was a wall, a curved wall, plastered, painted. The paint was still there, blues and reds and yellows, faded but unmistakably deliberate, applied to wet plaster in the technique known as fresco, the same technique used in the finest domestic interiors of Rome itself, the same technique visible in the surviving wall decorations of Pompeii and Herculaneum. In the arena wall of a Roman amphitheatre, on the northernmost edge of the known world, 800 miles from Rome, someone had commissioned painted decoration of a quality and ambition that Tony Wilmot, who had been excavating Roman sites in Britain for 3 decades, described as being of international importance. There are no parallels for it in Roman Britain. Not one, and that is precisely the point. To understand why a painted arena wall in a rain-soaked English field matters, it is necessary to understand what the Romans were trying to accomplish in the provinces they conquered. Military conquest was, in Roman strategic thinking, only the first step. The harder problem, the problem that determined whether a conquered territory remained pacified or erupted in revolt a generation later, was cultural integration. How do you take a population that has its own language, its own religious practices, its own social hierarchies, and its own deeply held sense of collective identity, and make them Romans, not just compliant subjects, people who understood themselves as participants in the Roman world, who had internalized Roman values, who found Roman institutions familiar and desirable rather than alien and imposed? The Romans tried many approaches to this problem. They built roads, which created economic integration. They established colonies of Roman citizens in conquered territories, which created demographic mixing. They extended Roman citizenship progressively to provincial elites, which created political investment. They built temples, bathhouses, forums, and market buildings, which created the physical infrastructure of Roman urban life. And they built amphitheatres. Paul Patterson, the historian responsible for the research program at Richborough, has argued that of all the tools in the Roman cultural integration toolkit, the amphitheatre was uniquely effective because it was the only one that created a shared emotional experience rather than simply a shared physical environment. You could walk past a Roman temple without engaging with it. You could use a Roman bathhouse without understanding or caring about the civilization that built it. But sitting in an amphitheatre, watching the same spectacles that 50,000 people were watching simultaneously in Rome, responding to the same cues, sharing the same reactions with the strangers seated beside you, that created something that a road or a bathhouse could not. It created the feeling of being Roman. Archaeologists have noted that this distinction between the infrastructure of Roman life and the experience of Roman identity is central to understanding why amphitheatre construction was prioritized in newly conquered territories in ways that the purely practical requirements of military occupation would not have demanded. The Richborough Amphitheatre was not built for entertainment in any leisurely sense of that word. It was built within years, possibly within months of the initial Roman landing in 43 AD, at a moment when the military situation in Britain was still unresolved and the Roman presence was still primarily a military one. This timing is significant. It tells us that whoever ordered the construction of the Richborough Amphitheatre, and the evidence suggests this was a decision made at a high level of military command, not a spontaneous local initiative, understood the amphitheatre not as a luxury to be added once the conquest was secure, but as an instrument of the conquest itself. The use of local chalk block for the arena walls, identified by Paul Patterson as evidence of rapid early construction, confirms this interpretation. The builders were not waiting for premium materials to be shipped from Gaul or Italy. They were using what was immediately available because they needed the building quickly. The fresco decoration added later the blues and reds and yellows that Wilmot found surviving beneath 9 feet of debris suggests that once the immediate military situation stabilized, significant resources were invested in upgrading the building's aesthetic quality to something approaching the standards of comparable structures in more established parts of the empire. The casa, the holding chamber off the arena wall, whose timber doorframe Wilmot identified from the stain pattern in the mortar floor, tells us that the Richborough Amphitheatre was running a full program of arena spectacle, including the incarceration and release of animals or condemned prisoners, consistent with the standard Roman entertainment format replicated across the empire, 800 miles from Rome. Within years of the initial invasion, full production values. One theory suggests that the speed and completeness of amphitheatre construction at newly conquered sites like Richborough was a deliberate imperial policy, a standardized protocol for cultural pacification that was applied systematically as the legions advanced, building the infrastructure of Roman identity ahead of the formal administrative structures that would follow. The amphitheatre came first. The law courts and the tax collectors came later. The Richborough Amphitheatre tells one version of this story, Rome imposing its cultural infrastructure on a conquered population at the point of a sword. The amphitheatre discovered beneath a grass field outside Volterra, in Tuscany, tells a different, and in some ways more revealing version. Volterra was not a newly conquered territory. It was not a military frontier. It was an ancient Etruscan city that had been under Roman control for centuries by the time its amphitheatre was built. The Etruscans, the civilization that had dominated central Italy before Rome's rise, whose art, religion, and urban planning had profoundly influenced early Roman culture, had been progressively absorbed into the Roman political system over the course of the Republican period. But absorption was not the same as assimilation. The leading families of Etruscan cities maintained their local identities, their ancestral connections, and their cultural distinctiveness, even as they adopted Roman citizenship and participated in Roman political life. The tension between Etruscan heritage and Roman identity was real, persistent, and in the case of Volterra's most prominent family, politically consequential. The Caecinas were an Etruscan family of enormous local prestige. Aulus Caecina, in the 1st century BC, had written a public tirade against Julius Caesar and been exiled for it, a serious political disgrace that placed the family in direct opposition to the emerging Caesarian faction. Over the following century, however, the Caecinas performed one of the more remarkable political rehabilitations in Roman history. By the time of Emperor Augustus, members of the family were serving as senators in Rome. They were generals, they were imperial administrators, they were, by every external measure, Romans. And in Volterra, they built a theatre and an amphitheatre. The 3D laser scanning work conducted by Paul Aubin and Mark Dietrich of the Volterra excavation team revealed, through comparative analysis of the structural geometry of the theatre and the newly discovered amphitheatre, that both buildings appear to have been designed by the same architect, constructed within the same general period, and financed by the same family. The architectural evidence, combined with the historical record of the Caecinas' political trajectory, points to a specific and intentional act of cultural self-positioning. Archaeologists have noted that the Caecinas were not building these structures for the entertainment of Volterra's population. They were building them as monuments to their own Roman identity demonstrations, addressed as much to Rome as to their local community, that the family which had once defied Caesar now fully embraced the values, the spectacles, and the cultural priorities of the imperial system. The amphitheatre at Volterra was, in this reading, a loyalty statement built in stone. A family that had been on the wrong side of history was using architecture to write itself back onto the right side. One theory suggests that this pattern, provincial elites using amphitheatre construction as a form of political communication directed toward the imperial centre, was far more common across the empire than the surviving documentary record makes immediately apparent. Of the 230 amphitheatres identified across the Roman world, the majority were not built by imperial decree. They were built by local initiative, by municipal councils, by wealthy individuals seeking status, by families with something to prove. The empire did not need to mandate amphitheatre construction. It simply needed to make amphitheatre construction the most legible available language of loyalty and belonging, and then let the provinces speak it voluntarily. 230 amphitheatres. Built between the 1st century BC and the 4th century AD. Distributed from Hadrian's Wall in northern England to the edge of the Sahara in North Africa, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Euphrates River in modern Syria, all of them elliptical, all of them oriented with the long axis of the arena, aligned to maximize sightlines from the primary seating areas, all of them equipped, in some form, with the holding chambers, entrance corridors, and arena floor arrangements that the spectacle format required, all of them in whatever material was locally available: limestone in France, sandstone in North Africa, chalk in Britain, reproducing the essential spatial and experiential logic of the Colosseum. Tony Wilmot has described this standardization as one of the most remarkable achievements of Roman cultural engineering. The creation, across an empire of 50 million people and 5 million square kilometers, of a recognizable shared experience that transcended language, ethnicity, local custom, and geographic distance. A soldier transferred from a garrison in Syria to a posting in Britain would find, in Richborough, an amphitheatre that functioned identically to the one he had left behind. A merchant travelling from Carthage to Lyon would find, in both cities, an arena where the same spectacles unfolded according to the same conventions, where the crowd responded to the same cues, where the emperor's image, even in his absence, presided over the same ritual of power and submission. Archaeologists have noted that no other institution in the ancient world achieved this level of experiential standardization across such a vast geographical range. Not temples, whose practices varied significantly by region and deity. Not bathhouses, whose design and social customs differed considerably between provinces. Not even the Roman legal system, which accommodated substantial local variation in its actual application. The amphitheatre was the one Roman institution that was the same everywhere. What remains unexplained, and what the continuing excavations at sites like Richborough and Volterra are only beginning to illuminate, is the precise mechanism by which this standardization was achieved and maintained across 3 centuries of political change, cultural evolution, and imperial expansion. No design manual for amphitheatre construction survives. No imperial directive specifying amphitheatre dimensions or programming requirements has been found. No centralized authority for overseeing provincial amphitheatre construction is documented in any surviving administrative record. The network built itself 230 times across 5 million square kilometers. Over 300 years, the same building appeared, and in every one of them, the same show played. 2. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over an archaeological site when the excavation stops. Not the silence of completion, not the silence of answers found and questions resolved, the silence of a decision, a moment when the tools are set down, the permits expire, the funding runs out, or the institutional will to continue simply ceases to be available. The questions do not stop existing when the excavation stops. They simply stop being asked. Beneath the Colosseum, in the spring of 2024, that silence is louder than it has been at any point in the past century. 5 separate lines of investigation, each begun with significant scientific promise, each producing preliminary findings that demanded follow-up, have reached the same point of suspension. Not conclusion, not resolution, suspension. The questions each investigation opened are still open. The answers each investigation pointed toward remain, for now, out of reach. What follows is an account of where those 5 investigations stand, what they have established, what they have suggested, and what specifically remains unknown. The original engineering specifications for the Colosseum's hypogeum, the counterweight ratios, the shaft dimensions, the mechanical coordination protocols for the 80 elevator system have never been found. This is not, as we have established, for lack of a search. The administrative archives of late 1st century Rome have been systematically examined wherever they survive. The papyrus collections of Roman Egypt, the epigraphic record of the Italian peninsula, the surviving fragments of Flavianera, imperial correspondence, none of them contain anything that resembles a technical specification for the Colosseum's mechanical infrastructure. In 2019, fragments of late 1st century administrative documents referencing construction activity at what appears to be the Colosseum were recovered near the Lateran Palace, less than a kilometre from the site. The fragments were too damaged to yield specific technical content, but they confirmed that the administrative record existed, that documents were created, filed, and stored somewhere in the Imperial bureaucratic system. Where that somewhere is, and whether anything survives in it, is unknown. What remains unexplained is whether the undeveloped subsurface zones within the 1 kilometer radius of the Colosseum zones that have never been archaeologically investigated due to the presence of modern buildings above them contain archival material from the Flavian period that has not been seen since the Western Empire's collapse. The technology to investigate those zones non-invasively exists. The investigation has not been undertaken. The 2015 GPR survey, conducted by the Politecnico di Milano, identified 3 distinct layers of subsurface structural activity beneath the Colosseum's current foundation level. The first 2 layers, the Flavian hypogeum and the buried remains of the pre-Neronian neighbourhood, are consistent with the known building history of the site. The third layer is not. At 9 to 12 meters below the hypogeum floor, the survey identified geometrically regular void spaces whose nature the Milan team declined to characterize definitively. The recommended follow-up investigation targeted micro-excavation at 3 specific locations was submitted to the Soprintendenza Speciale di Roma in late 2015. It has not been approved. 3 alternative non-invasive investigation methods, high-resolution GPR, resurvey, seismic tomography, and muon radiography, would be capable of characterizing the deep anomalies without physical excavation. Muon radiography in particular, which uses naturally occurring cosmic ray particles to image subsurface density variations, has been successfully applied to investigate hidden chambers in the Great Pyramid of Giza by a research consortium, including teams from Nagoya University and the French Alternative Energies and Atomic Energy Commission. The same technique was used in 2017 to identify a previously unknown void space above the Grand Gallery of the pyramid, a discovery that made international headlines and prompted immediate follow-up investigation. No application of muon radiography to the Colosseum's deep anomaly zone has been proposed in any publicly available research agenda. Archaeologists have noted that the absence of further investigation does not mean the anomalies are unimportant. It means they are uninvestigated. These are different conditions, and conflating them produces a false impression of resolved uncertainty. What lies at 9 to 12 meters beneath the Colosseum floor is, as of this writing, unknown. The 2023 MIT and Harvard study published in Science Advances, led by Adma Masic, characterized the self-healing mechanism of Roman concrete with a precision and rigor that previous research had not achieved. The identification of reactive limeclasts as the operative feature of Roman concrete's longevity was a genuine scientific advance, one that has direct practical implications for modern construction engineering, where the durability of concrete infrastructure is a significant and growing problem. But the Masic study was explicit about its own limitations. The samples analyzed came from a specific range of Roman structures, concentrated in the Bay of Naples region and the harbour at Caesarea Maritima. The volcanic ash composition, the lime processing parameters, and the aggregate selection visible in those samples represent one regional variant of Roman concrete practice. The concrete used in the Colosseum, produced in Rome, using pozzolana sourced from the Phlegrean fields, mixed and poured under the supervision of construction managers, whose identities and methods are entirely undocumented, has not been the subject of comparable microstructural analysis. One theory suggests that the Colosseum's concrete, produced at the center of the Imperial construction industry rather than in a provincial context, may represent a more refined or more deliberately optimized version of the formula than the samples analyzed in the 2023 study. The building's survival through 17 centuries of seismic activity, stone quarrying, flooding, fire, and structural neglect is, by any engineering standard, remarkable. Whether that survival reflects the same self-healing mechanism identified by Masic, a variant of it, or additional features not yet characterized, is currently unknown. The systematic microstructural analysis of Colosseum concrete samples using the methodology developed by Masic's team has not been published as of this writing. The preliminary findings of the 2021 Politecnico di Milano hydraulic survey, which identified a dual-function drainage and water supply network connecting the Colosseum substructure to a branch of the Aqua Claudia aqueduct, have not been published in peer-reviewed form. The research team presented their findings in preliminary form at the 2022 conference of the International Association for Classical Archaeology. The full technical report, which would include the survey methodology, the specific conduit dimensions and orientations identified, and the team's engineering reconstruction of the flooding and drainage sequence, was described at that conference as being in preparation for journal submission. As of the research period for this documentary, it has not appeared. This matters because the hydraulic survey findings are the only direct physical evidence yet identified for the mechanism by which the Colosseum's arena could have been flooded for naval spectacles. Without the full technical report, the connection between the GP-identified conduit channels and the Aqua Claudia remains an architectural inference rather than a documented finding. The ancient accounts of the naumachia in the Colosseum, Cassius Dio's description of warships in the flooded arena, remain corroborated by suggestive but incomplete physical evidence. What remains unexplained, pending the full publication of the Milan Hydraulic Survey, is whether the water system identified in the 2021 survey is technically capable of delivering the volume of water required to float the warships that Dio describes, within the time frame that his account implies. In 2023, the Italian Ministry of Culture approved an €18 million project to install a new retractable wooden floor over the Colosseum's exposed hypogeum. The project, developed by the architecture and engineering firm Milan Ingegneria in consultation with the Colosseum Archaeological Park, involves the placement of structural support posts directly into the upper level of the hypogeum at approximately 80 locations around the arena perimeter. The ground preparation work required for those support posts leveling, clearing, and in some areas reinforcing the upper hypogeum surface will disturb soil layers that have not been systematically excavated. The preliminary archaeological assessment conducted before the project's approval identified organic material, metal fragments, and structural anomalies in the upper hypogeum floor at several of the proposed support post locations. The assessment recommended further investigation of these features before ground preparation work began. That further investigation was not completed before the project received approval. Archaeologists have noted that once the support posts are in place and the new floor is installed above them, the disturbed soil zones around each post location will no longer be accessible for investigation. The installation is not reversible in any practical sense. The floor, once in place, is expected to remain in place indefinitely. It is designed as a permanent feature of the restored Colosseum interior, not as a temporary installation. One theory suggests that the organic material and metal fragments identified in the preliminary assessment are consistent with the kind of operational debris, food waste, equipment fragments, animal remains that would have accumulated in the upper hypogeum during the Colosseum's active period, and that their archaeological value, while real, is not exceptional enough to justify delaying an €18 million restoration project. Another theory suggests that in a site with the archaeological complexity and research history of the Colosseum, no soil layer should be considered archaeologically routine until it has been examined. The preliminary assessment identified anomalies. Anomalies, by definition, are features that do not fit the expected pattern. What those anomalies represent, whether they are routine debris or something less expected, is something that could have been determined before the ground was disturbed. It was not. The new floor is being installed. The anomalies beneath it will not be examined. Whatever they are, they will remain unknown beneath a surface that 2,000 years of history has demonstrated a consistent tendency to make things disappear. 5 unresolved questions. 5 points at which investigation has stopped short of resolution. 5 places where the archaeology of the most studied ancient building on Earth has reached the edge of what current institutional will, funding priorities, and administrative decision-making have allowed it to find. This is not a conspiracy. It is not, in most cases, even a deliberate choice. It is the ordinary condition of archaeological research at a site whose complexity exceeds the resources devoted to understanding it. Managed by institutions whose priorities are shaped by visitor numbers, conservation requirements, political considerations, and budgetary constraints that have nothing to do with the scientific questions at stake. But the questions remain. Beneath the new floor, beneath the uninvestigated deep anomaly zone, beneath the unanalyzed concrete, behind the unpublished hydraulic survey, somewhere within the undeveloped subsurface of the kilometer surrounding the building, the answers to some of those questions are probably still there. Rome has been hiding its secrets for 2,000 years. It is, by any measure, extraordinarily good at it. What remains unexplained is not any single finding or any single gap in the record. What remains unexplained is the full picture, the complete account of what was built here, how it was built, what it was used for, what it replaced, and what still lies undisturbed beneath the city that has been building itself on top of its own past. Layer by layer, for 30 centuries. The machine is still down there. The blueprint is still missing. The deep anomalies are still uncharacterized. The water is long gone, but the channels that carried it are still in the ground. And in a few months, a new wooden floor will cover the last accessible surface above all of it. The Colosseum, which has been many things to many people across 20 centuries, is about to become something it has never quite been before. A secret with a lid on it. We began with a drill, a simple piece of equipment, operated by engineers from the Soprintendenza Speciale di Roma in 2014, boring downward through the compacted earth beneath the Colosseum's foundation zone in a routine structural assessment. The drill stopped, not because it hit rock, because it hit nothing, a hollow space, a void in the ground beneath one of the most studied buildings on Earth, at a depth and in a location that no existing map, no existing survey, no existing record of any kind had predicted or accounted for. That moment, a drill stopping in unexpected silence is, in miniature, the story of everything we have covered in the past 2 hours. The Colosseum is not a solved problem. It is an open one, and the more carefully it is examined, the more open it becomes. We have travelled through 9 layers of this building's hidden history. We found a mechanical system of 80 elevator shafts, capable of delivering wild animals to the arena surface in 30 seconds, whose original engineering specifications have never been found. We found a wooden floor designed from the beginning to be removed, transformed, within a single afternoon, into a water basin large enough to float warships, and then watched that floor disappear from history without a single written record of where it went. We found concrete walls whose self-healing chemistry was not scientifically characterized until 2023, mixed according to a formula that no surviving Roman text describes, in a building constructed in 10 years without a single surviving blueprint. We found the bones of gladiators in Ephesus, whose diet, injuries, and surgical treatment told a story entirely different from the one that 2,000 years of popular mythology had been telling in their place. We found the political machinery behind the building's construction, the calculated erasure of Nero's private lake, the gold of Jerusalem poured into public spectacle, the Imperial box positioned so that 50,000 people could never quite forget who held the power of life and death over everything they were watching. We found 3 buried layers beneath the foundation, the deepest of them uninvestigated and unexplained. We found the church dismantling the building with one hand and sanctifying it with the other. We found 230 amphitheatres stretched across 5 million square kilometres, all running the same show, all speaking the same language of power and belonging and controlled fear. And we found a new wooden floor, approved and funded, and under installation, being lowered over the last accessible surface above questions that have not been answered. Here is what all of it adds up to. The Colosseum was never simply a building. It was a system for producing spectacle, for manufacturing identity, for distributing power, for making 50,000 individuals feel, simultaneously, that they belonged to something larger than themselves, and that the something larger than themselves was watching them back. It was the most sophisticated instrument of social engineering the ancient world produced, and it worked. For 4 centuries, across an empire of 50 million people, it worked. What the archaeology beneath it keeps finding: the missing blueprints, the buried layers, the uncharacterized anomalies, the unpublished surveys, suggests that the system was even more sophisticated than the visible structure implies, that there are dimensions of what was built here, and why, and how, that we have not yet recovered. This is not a comfortable conclusion. We prefer our ancient wonders to be understood, catalogued, explained, filed under the appropriate heading in the appropriate textbook. The Colosseum has been standing for nearly 2,000 years. We have been studying it seriously for at least 2 centuries. The idea that it still contains fundamental mysteries, that the ground beneath it holds answers we have not found and may soon lose access to permanently. This sits uneasily with the confidence we tend to bring to our knowledge of the ancient world. But that unease is, perhaps, exactly where we should be. Every era gets the Colosseum it deserves. The Romans got a machine for spectacle and control. The medieval church got a sacred ruin and a quarry. The 19th century got a romantic monument to the grandeur of fallen empire. The 20th century got a tourist destination and a symbol. What the 21st century is getting, if it pays attention, is something more interesting than any of those. A building that keeps refusing to be fully known. A structure that generates new questions faster than existing tools can answer the old ones. A 2,000-year-old machine that is still, in its quiet way, still running, somewhere beneath the new wooden floor, beneath the hypogeum, beneath the buried Republican streets, at 9 to 12 meters of depth in the dark beneath Rome. Something is there. We do not know what it is. That is not a failure of archaeology. That is an invitation. If you are watching this from somewhere in the world tonight, whether it is morning where you are, or late at night, whether you are in a city that was once inside the Roman Empire, or one that the legions never reached, leave your location in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from. I want to know how far this story has travelled, and if there is a question from tonight's documentary that stayed with you, something unexplained that you want to go deeper on, a mystery that this episode opened rather than closed, tell me that too. The next chapter of this story is already waiting. This has been Mr. H. The Chronicles continue.